Welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm very excited to be able to introduce you to our next webinar in the series on extending DevOps practices to SQL Server databases. I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping points just beforehand. Today's webinar will be recorded, so if you do have to duck out halfway through, don't worry, we'll make the recording available afterwards. We will, however, though, keep a clear line throughout the webinar, so all of our attendees, unfortunately, will have their microphones muted. But if you take a look in the GoToMeeting console that you've hopefully got on your screen right now, you'll see a little area where you have a questions box, and you can tap your questions in there, and throughout today's presentation, Arneh or myself will be happy to answer those questions. If for any reason we don't get to cover all of the questions today as part of the live presentation, then please don't worry, we will make sure that we follow up afterwards to get you the answers that you need to any points that haven't been made clear. So first of all, let me introduce myself. You may not recognize the voice. I haven't presented on one of these webinars so far in this series. My name is Tom Austin. I'm head of pre-sales engineering for our EMEA and APAC regions. So I mainly look after kind of Europe, South Africa, Australia, those regions where Redgate's very active. I've been with Redgate for around about 10 years, and throughout all of that time, I've really focused on helping people to improve their change management processes when it comes to the database. And of course, more recently, that's lent itself quite nicely to assisting our customers adopting their DevOps practices. I'm very excited to be joined today by Arneh, the regular voice that you might hear on these presentations. Arneh, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. Hey, everyone. My name is Arneh Eskandari. Just like Tom, I'm the sales engineering on the North America region, working with new customers, existing customers, helping them, get onboarded with DevOps for databases, starting from, demos, setting up POCs, and also post-sales implementation and making recommendations on best practices and so on. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can find my contact details here on the slide.
Excellent, fantastic. Thank you, Arneh. It's the first time Arneh and I have worked together actually in about the last 2 years, so it's nice to get the old team back together. So let me take you through. Yeah. Indeed. Let me take you guys through a rough agenda for today's presentation. So I'm going to start just by going through a very few slides introducing anybody who's not familiar with Redgate to the company that Arneh and I work for, and then just spend a little bit of time talking about some of the challenges of adopting these DevOps processes that Arneh and I both mentioned in our introductions there, and how it can be tough to apply some of these principles to the database, and what the effect of those challenges are on the real world situations that Arneh and myself see on a day-to-day basis when working with large organizations, small organizations, medium organizations, anybody who actually wants to improve the way that they deliver database change. We'll kind of wrap this up, of course, by relating it all back to what the benefits are of adopting these DevOps practices, specifically when we're referring to databases and, of course, database lifecycle management, the partner in crime, if you like, to application lifecycle management, and then go on to talk a little bit about how Redgate can help with its broader toolset that supports those DevOps practices. Arneh's then going to take over and give us a fantastic demo of some of the tools working in exactly the ways that we'll describe as part of the initial presentation. And I'm really excited to see particularly the bit that he has planned for us around the automated testing, which is a fantastic area where we can really add some great benefit to the typical processes that we see in place within the organizations that we help to support. So let's get stuck into that initial introduction of Redgate software. So Redgate is 18 years old. In fact, it was 18 years old last week. If you head on over to the website, you'll see some particularly odd photographs. Every year they get all of us outside to take a birthday photograph, and this year was possibly one of the funnest yet. So please do take a peek at that picture. But we've across that time period really focused on making tools to help teams build software. And so we have over 200,000 customers. Within that customer base, you'll find 91% of Fortune 100 companies. And as we both described a moment ago, it's important to us to make sure that we help teams, help organizations to make sure that their database development processes keep pace with developments in the application development world. And so to support this, we also have a great community presence through things like SimpleTalk and SQL Server Central that allow us to take a proactive approach, I guess, to educating the community on how you can adopt these practices and how you can take the best bits of application development and apply them to the database world without having to worry that it's going to cause lots of nasty issues and all sorts of additional problems to overcome. In terms of DevOps practices, well, Redgate actually released 1,058 times last year. So in terms of increasing the frequency of releases, that's something that we know all about. So we really do practice what we preach. So let's take a look at some of these challenges that we keep referring to. Just before we do that, though, we are going to run a quick poll. I've introduced you kind of briefly to Redgate software. Be interested to know which of you out there are already using Redgate tools or are already familiar with Redgate tools. So let me just launch this poll. It should pop up on your screen any second now. And I'd really appreciate it if you can just take a moment just to give us a little bit of feedback on which tools you're familiar with. So Arneh, whilst our audience are filling this out today, what's a typical response? What are you expecting to see here?
Yeah, I mean, a typical response would be a lot of SQL compare, data compare users. And what has been interesting recently is that we're seeing a big jump on the SQL source control users, which is very exciting. That means people are taking the the right step towards getting a proper release or delivery process in place for their databases.
Of course, it's the foundation, right? You can't do anything until you've got your source control. So that's great to see.
Exactly.
Well, it's I mean, the results are just about all in. There's a couple left that we're waiting for. I'll just give those guys a couple more seconds. But yeah, it kind of aligns with exactly what you were suggesting there. So a whole bunch of people familiar with SQL compare, SQL data compare. A nice chunk of people already familiar with or using SQL source control, and actually quite a large section in that other group. I suspect that's everybody's favorite tool, SQL prompt, right?
Exactly, yeah.
I've also had a message, a private message, somebody out there using SQL clone. Fantastic. I'm glad to hear you're embracing one of Redgate's newest and most recent releases. So good to hear. Okay.
Go James Chapman.
Indeed. So let's finish up that poll. I'll just share the results ever so quickly. So there we go. Those are the patterns that I think Arneh outlined almost exactly there. So good to see you know your market, Arneh. Pleased to.
I try.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these issues then. Some of these challenges of integrating databases into DevOps processes. Now, we've got a couple of points on the screen here. We could have put more. We could have had a big list of challenges here because you talk to anybody involved with the land of databases, and they will soon be able to give you a list of all of the things that become a big struggle to them. But ultimately, I think for me, it all comes back to one single point, and that's, I guess, most strongly highlighted by our first point here, and it's that need to preserve data. In the world of applications, we don't really have to worry about this. We can throw away entire applications and rebuild them and redeploy them, and nothing has to persist, nothing has to stay behind. Whereas when we talk about databases, this is the holder for the data that drives our day-to-day business decisions, it drives our revenue streams, it drives everything to do with our businesses continuing to be able to function. And so we have to be so careful about how we interact with these production systems, how we make changes to them to ensure that actually at the end of the day, once the intended upgrade in abilities has been deployed to that target, we haven't actually lost any functionality. We haven't actually gone backwards. We haven't lost a whole load of people's account details or order details and things like this. So it all really revolves around this point of having to be able to almost negotiate with a SQL Server database to encourage it to change to a state that we want it to be in without losing any of that good stuff that we need to be there for our businesses to continue. So there are lots of different ways that we can help manage this pipeline of changes through to our production databases. And if you don't get this right, and you actually have a process in place that doesn't support that key principle of preserving that data, then there's a whole bunch of secondary issues that can surface. And these, I'm sure you can look down this list here and think of a time where you've been bitten by one of these problems. Some of the biggest ones that jump out to me are, this idea of little or no traceability of database changes. It's so common for me to speak to organizations who have no real idea of what version of their database is where. They can't see who changed what, they can't tell what's been deployed, they can't tell what exists in their staging environment that doesn't or hasn't been through their testing environment. And all of these areas really mean that actually what happens is the database begins to hold back the throughput of the application. So I speak to customers on a regular daily basis, and many of the customers that I speak to are rightfully really proud of the DevOps practices and processes that they've put in place. And they tell me about these rich pipelines that have very short cycle times where they're able to make a change to a piece of code and 2 hours later it's there in production. And often I push back and I say, okay, great. So what happens when a change that you want to make involves an underlying change to the database schema? And this is where things go really quiet. And this is where it's almost the big secret that nobody talks about, that actually, even though they've got these very rich pipelines in place, often if a change requires an alteration to the database, then the entire process that they've described to me is worthless because they can't push database change through that same pipeline. And this is something that Redgate wants to address. This is something that we want to make sure doesn't happen. We don't want the database to become the bottleneck in your agile delivery processes. We don't want you to have to fall back to kind of manual database deployment processes. We want you to be able to take the same tool set, the same principles, and apply that to the database so that you actually get all of those same benefits that your colleagues are receiving in the application world. And in fact, our own State of Database DevOps report recently showed us that 75% of organizations have developers working within their teams that work across both the application and the database. So there's even a huge set of people out there that are getting the benefits of these practices and processes, but only in half their job, only on the application side, not on the database side. And that's a crazy situation for us to be in. So we want to make sure that we put that right. If you are able to put that right and you are able to embrace these DevOps practices and principles, then actually what we're aiming to achieve here is this greater level of repeatability and reliability. I often talk about throughput and stability, which is essentially the same things. When talking about DevOps, we often talk about cycle times. How quickly can you come up with an idea or a fix and put that through your process and have that arrive in production? And what we want to do is reduce that cycle time as much as possible, so that if something's going wrong, you can put something into source control, it flows through a process and it gets fixed in production without that taking days, weeks, or months. But what's really important is that whilst we decrease the amount of time that takes, we want to maintain the level of stability that's available to us. So we want to not compromise on ensuring that actually our changes are reliable. We want to make sure that by the time that change reaches our production environment, we're very, very confident that it's going to be a successful change, that it's going to be a change that's a good one to make by running things like schema validation, by carrying out things like automated unit testing. It just gives us that knowledge that actually we are able to release on our schedule. Nothing's holding us back, nothing's forcing us to go faster, but when we want to make a change, we can make it quickly and effectively. And that's really what the Redgate tools are trying to support. But why? Why are all of these organizations looking to DevOps practices as the answer to this? Well, there's growing evidence to support that DevOps practices and processes, some of which have their kind of history and their roots embedded in other earlier movements from software development world and also the manufacturing world. And these vastly refined practices and processes that we're seeing come to light today under the DevOps banner, those organizations which are more mature in their approach to these and have embraced these techniques more, those are the organizations that we're actually seeing are outperforming their objectives by much greater numbers. And you can take a couple of key indicators of this. So, you can see on the screen here that those organizations are deploying code 46 times more frequently, and actually being able to do that with 5 times lower change failure rates, which 96 times faster recovery from downtime. That's a huge gulf that we're talking about between those high performers and those low performers. And actually, overall, in general, those firms with those higher performing IT organizations, they're twice as likely to exceed their profitability, market share, and productivity goals. So these adjustments that we're making within the software delivery process on the application and as we're going to suggest the database side, are actually resulting in these huge benefits in the wider business and commercial sense. So how does this actually relate to what Redgate provide? I mean, I've kind of touched on it, I've alluded to it a little bit, but really it's kind of summed up quite nicely in this diagram. One of my favorite definitions of DevOps is one by Donovan Brown, Microsoft's senior DevOps program manager, and he says that DevOps is the coming together of people, process, and products to facilitate the continuous delivery of value to our end users. So, making sure that we are able to give our customers good stuff more regularly and with quicker feedback loops. And what we can see here is, if we look at this diagram, kind of the people and the process is already known to us. We know we have developers who make changes to code. In the database world, we know we have DBAs who are responsible for often managing that deployment out. We know we have processes. We know that key parts of DevOps processes and practices are adopting things like source control and automation. And really what we've lacked historically is a product set and the tools that enable us to take these processes and provide them to the people that we see involved on the database side of this equation, so the database developers and the DBAs. And that's really the bridge that Redgate hopes to cross by using the tools that we see on the screen here, which of course largely make up Redgate's SQL Toolbelt solution. And we want to do this by plugging into the tools that you guys already have in place for the rich pipelines that you tell me about all the time. So that a lot of you are already using source control systems such as Git and TFS or VSTS for your application code. A lot of people that I speak to already have Jenkins in place, or again TFS or TeamCity, and loads of people are using now Octopus Deploy and Microsoft Release Management for deploying their application code. So let's use those same pipelines, but bring the database to them so that we're actually pushing our application changes and our database changes through that exact same pipeline. So let's just briefly talk through the screen here. It all starts, Arneh mentioned it earlier, it all starts with source control, right? Source control is the foundation of this thing. We need to have our database code within a source control repository so that we can see who changed what, when, and why, and use that as the building blocks for all of the rich improvements that we can build on top of it, such as continuous integration. So that source control repository is going to capture for us the state of our database after having made some development changes. So, we want to add a new table, we want to add a new stored procedure. We make that change and then we capture it in the source control repository. Once it's in that source control repository, though, we can then build on top of that, a continuous integration process to validate that new version of the database for us. So when I say validate, what I'm talking about specifically here is taking those individual files that have been added to the source control repository, representing our various objects that make up our database and perhaps some reference data and static data there as well, and make sure that we can take these and put them all back together to form a database. Make sure that all of our references are intact. Make sure that any changes that we've made in one area haven't broken any dependencies on other objects within the database. And on top of this, we can then, once we've validated that new state, start running some automated testing to make sure that actually that new state not only is valid, but also behaves in the way that we expect it to, and will be able to deliver the value that it's intended to deliver further up the chain. And as we come to that bit further up the chain, we then want to be able to pass on some artifacts to our release management tooling, which might be overseen by our DBA, to enable them to deliver that change out to our target environments, testing, QA, staging, and ultimately up to production. Now, of course, the DevOps story doesn't stop there. That is the point at which we are going to deliver our presentation up to today. But off the back of that, we then have all sorts of things like monitoring, backup, visibility of where the various different versions of your database are. And you could even come back round to the beginning of this diagram and start talking about, okay, how do we provision realistic development environments based upon this new state that we have in production? And again, you know, Redgate do provide tooling across the wider DevOps story. And if you're interested in that, we'll share with you a slide at the end of Arneh's demonstration today, where you can go and read a little bit more about that wider story as well. But with that in mind, Arneh, I think it would be interesting now for us to start taking a look at the detail and seeing exactly how this all comes together with those components of the Redgate SQL toolbar. So if you're all ready, I think I'm going to hand over to you to take us through the demonstration.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tom, for the great presentation. So let me go ahead and change the presenter to myself. All right. All right, so hopefully everyone can still see our screen okay. So for the rest of this session, I'm going to walk you through the Redgate tools that you just saw as part of that diagram and show you how Redgate can help with an end-to-end database DevOps process for SQL Server. So as Tom mentioned, one of the key components and the foundation of a successful DevOps process is source control. So we're going to take a look at how Redgate can help source control your database changes to begin with. And then from there, we're going to take a look at how we can then take what we put in source control, build it, and then deliver that to our target environment. So for the purpose of today's demo, I'm going to be using Git as my source control system. So I'll just be using GitHub. And I'll also use TeamCity and Octopus Deploy as my build and release management tool. Now, it's great that almost 50% of our attendees today are source controlling their database changes using SQL source control. But for those of you who are still following a manual process, what I normally find is, developers are in charge of saving up their change scripts and then either manually checking those change scripts into source control with the specific ordering and then executing those change scripts either through a DBA or an operations team against their target environments. Some people also use ticketing systems as a band-aid to at least have sort of an audit trail of what changes came from which developers, which is still a very manual process, and that must go away if you're looking into improving the reliability of your change management process for your databases. So let's go ahead and get started. So the databases that I'll be working with today is the setup wide word importers databases. So here I have a development database which represents the database that I'll be working with and making changes to. And I also have a couple of other databases that represent my higher environments that I'll be deploying to as part of our release process. The first thing you notice with my development database is that the database icon is green. This is an indicator of the database being linked to source control through our SQL Source Control plugin, which is what you're seeing here in the middle. SQL Source Control basically acts as a bridge between your development environment and an existing source control system, such as Git, or regardless of what Git server you're using, whether it's GitHub, Bitbucket, or even TFS or VSTS, or other source control systems, such as TFS version control or Subversion. So my database is currently linked to my Git repository. Basically what that means is I've linked my database to my local repository that I've cloned from GitHub. So if you're starting with this project from scratch, or you're getting up and running with SQL Source Control, that means you'll start with an empty repository. And when you link your database to that repository, then SQL Source Control will populate your repository with the right folder structure for your database object. So I'll show you in a little bit what that folder structure actually looks like. So currently there is nothing to commit from my database into source control. So that means my database is currently synced with source control. There is no object differences or data differences for lookup table. So where we need to go ahead and make a couple of changes here in our development environment. Another thing that I wanted to quickly touch on, specifically around Git, is branching and merging. So here at the top right corner, you notice that I'm currently on this feature branch. So it's very important for you to have the right branching strategy. If you're working with a project that has different features with different release timelines, whether you're working on short-term features, long-term features, bug fixes, it's really important to sort of use the right branching strategy to be able to actually push those out to your target environment as part of an automated delivery process, where you won't have to actually cherry pick what changes you want to deploy at the point of deployment. So branching can help with that. So in this case, I have a very simple branching strategy set up where I'm committing my changes into a feature branch first, and then when my changes are ready to get built and deployed to my target environments, I would then merge those into my main branch or release branch or whatever you want to call it. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to make a couple of changes here to my dev environment. I'll make a table change as well as a store procedure change, and also a data change to a lookup table. So another great thing about SQL Source Control, for those of you who weren't aware of this, is that you can source control data from your lookup tables as well. So if I go to this link or running static data option inside SQL Source Control, I can actually select the tables that I want to source control in terms of data. And we normally recommend using this feature for lookup tables or configuration tables where the data is pretty consistent from your dev environment all the way to production environment. So here I have one table called the customer address type that I'm source controlling in terms of data. So any data changes I make to this table will also be tracked in source control and later on be deployed to our target environments. So, all right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and start making some changes to our dev environment. So let's start off by making a table change here first. So another great tool that some of you are probably already familiar with is SQL Prompt, which is our one of our productivity tools, which is a plugin to SSMS or Visual Studio, which makes your life as a SQL Server developer a lot easier, and it just makes coding actually more fun and smooth from within SSMS. So here I'm using the snippets of SQL Prompt to basically alter a table. As you can see, I've just typed in AT and hit tab. That just auto completes the statement for me. So going to add a column to one of my tables here. So let's just check that table real quick here. So I'm going to add a column to the salespeople table, call it sales region. Okay. And I'm going to set a default constraint. And let's just set our default region as America. Sorry, Tom.
No worries, I won't hold it against you.
All right, so we made a change to a table. I'm also going to quickly make a change to a stored procedure. So I'm actually looking for the stored procedure that actually returns the invoices from the day before, but I can't remember the exact name of it. So what I'm going to do is quickly search for that stored procedure. I do know that the name contained yesterday in the object name. So I just type in yesterday here using SQL search, and here comes my object that I'm interested in. So I simply select that in Object Explorer, and here it is. Make my change. And again, using SQL prompt, I can easily just pick the columns that I want to add to the select statement that I currently don't have. And I'm also going to format my code using SQL prompt. And this is another great feature that you can use to sort of standardize coding styles across your team and make sure everyone's coding in a similar fashion when it comes to SQL Server. So make my change, and finally also make a data change to that lookup table, the customer address type that I showed you earlier on. So let's just add a new record, and we're going to call this a secondary contact address type. All right, so made a couple of changes. Let's go ahead and commit our changes to source control. As you saw, as a developer, I didn't need to save any scripts up or manually keep track of my changes. All I need to focus on is making the changes and let SQL source control take care of keeping track of those changes and also help me commit those changes to source control. So let's go commit changes to source control here. Again, we're committing to our feature branch first. And so as you can see here, it's showing me the list of changes that I've made that I need to commit to source control. Here's the data change. So as you can see, what we're doing is we're storing your records from your table as insert scripts in source control. And then when it comes to doing the actual deployment, we compare these records from your source control to your target environments to see what data differences exist, and based on that, generate the right DML for your deployment. And for your objects, as you can see here, here's our store procedure that we modified. We store them as create scripts. So we carry the state of your database in source control as opposed to the individual change scripts. And then when it comes to doing the deployment, we compare that state from source control or your build package against your target environments to identify what differences exist and generate your deployment script off of that, of the differences that we find. So here you can quickly review what changes you've made and what's different between your development environment and what's already in your source control. So I'm happy with all these changes, so I'm going to go ahead and commit my changes to source control. Now, before I commit my changes to source control, we briefly mentioned testing earlier on. So one of the really important factors to a reliable and a safe delivery process, whether manual or automated, is to have the right tests in place. Now, this is especially more important when you're looking at automating a delivery process for any type of application, whether it's .NET or you have SQL Server databases as part of that. It's really important to have the right automated tests in place. So if there's any issues with your code, then those issues can be detected as early as possible before you hit any of your target environments. So there's a couple of options that you have as part of the Redgate toolset to help you with this. So one of those options is called SQL Test, which is another great tool that is also included as part of our SQL tool belt, which is the toolset that contains all the tools that we're presenting today as part of our demo. So SQL Test actually is broken down into two different testing frameworks. One is a static code analysis framework called SQL Cup, which makes sure that you're adhering to coding standards and best practices when it comes to making SQL Server changes or object changes. And the other part of it is unit tests. So you can actually write unit tests that are specific to your database objects or your stored procedures and make sure and test basically the logic of your programmable objects as part of that. So for instance, if you'll take a look at our development database here, here are the different types of tests that I actually have available as part of our static code analysis inside SQL test. So what I can do locally on my machine is to go ahead and run the test against my development database to make sure that I haven't actually missed anything, or I'm not meeting the coding standards from the changes that I made. So as you can see, all of my tests passed, and some of the ones that you might find interesting is some naming convention tests, so you can actually set a test to check for naming conventions, or performance checks for, when it comes to your stored procedures or even your tables, like for example, making sure that all your tables have primary keys and so on. So you can either run this test manually as part of your development process, and even run this test automatically as part of our automated build and delivery process. So the same tests that you see here are also can be ran automatically as part of our build process. Now, there is also another way that you can do this using another tool called SQL CodeGuard. SQL CodeGuard is actually a new tool to Redgate, which is a tool that we actually acquired a few months ago. And SQL CodeGuard, just like SQL Test, provides you with a set of static code analysis tests, but it has the range of tests that you get in SQL CodeGuard is a lot larger than what you see here as part of SQL Test. So let me just quickly show you that as well real quick. So here is SQL CodeGuard. As you can see, it has a plugin to SSMS where you can easily go ahead and check your rules and analyze any database that you have as part of your development environment or any other environment. So for instance, if I show you my rules here, there is actually different types of rules that you can set. So there's best practice rules. Again, there's a lot of similarity between SQL Test and CodeGuard on this side of things, and there is execution rules that you can set. As you can see here, it's very customizable. You can easily set which ones you want to ignore and which ones you actually do want to erase an alert if the test or the specific test fails. So as you can see, there is a lot of different types of tests provided out of box that you can just easily set up and enable on your databases, and either run this test manually or run them through a command line as part of an automated build process. So I can, just like SQL Test, I can go ahead and analyze my development database using SQL CodeGuard here, and this will tell me if my database is not adhering to any of those static code analysis tests that I've actually enabled as part of my rules. And these rules that we provide here, they're basically just saved as an XML file. So I can actually go ahead and use that same setting in my automated build process, which is what I've actually done, and you'll see that later in our build process. Okay. So because we have a larger number of rules to go through, as you can see, it's taking slightly longer to analyze our database, but as you can see, it analyzed 252 objects with all the tests that we had enabled, and there was no issues handling my database. So everything looks good. I'm actually more confident in the changes that I've made, and I'm happy to go ahead and commit those to source control now. So let's go back to SQL source control and commit our changes into our feature branch to start with. So since this is a demo, I'm just going to write a short comment here just to save us a bit of time. So make some changes to schema and data. Okay, so commit my changes to my local repository to start with. And from here, I can go ahead and push those changes off to my to GitHub. So I can just use this option here to push my changes. And now my changes are successfully checked in and pushed to our repository in GitHub. So let's go ahead and quickly take a look at our repository here. So here's the folder structure that we create when you link your databases to source control using SQL source control. So you don't need to do anything manually here. This is all taken care of by our tool when you link your database. And as you can see, here is the commit that I just actually looking at the wrong branch. My apologies. Here's the commit that I just made into my feature branch. So my next step here would be to, let's say that our changes are actually ready to go to our target environment. So my next step would be to actually merge those into my master branch, which will then go ahead and trigger a build in TeamCity and our CI environment. And if our build succeeds and all the tests pass, then we'll look at releasing those changes out to our target environment. So let's go ahead and merge our changes to our master branch using a pull request. Pull request is actually a very good tool as part of any Git repository. And the nice thing about it is if you want to do any code reviews or want someone to check your changes before they get merged, you can do all of that through a pull request. So for those of you who are using Git or are looking at Git, then doing your merges through a pull request is always a good idea. So I'm going to create a new pull request here to go from our feature branch to our master. And as you can see here at the bottom, it's showing me what differences exist between my master branch and my feature branch here. So that new record that I just added to source control is one of the differences. The change that I made to my store procedure, and also the column that I added to my sales people table. So everything looks good. And if there's any conflicts, obviously, you will catch those here. If there, for example, two developers have modified the same object, then you should see a conflict at the point of merge. So let's go ahead and create our pull request here. In this case, I don't need to review anything as I'm the only person making changes. So I'm just going to go ahead and confirm the merge to go to our master branch. Okay, so we merged our changes into master successfully, which is now going to trigger a build in my CI environment. As I mentioned earlier on, I'm using TeamCity as the build system. As Tom mentioned and described in the diagram, you can use any build system that exists out there that does accept PowerShell as a command line. We do have plugins for some build systems such as TeamCity, TFS, Bamboo, but you can use any, if you're using any other build systems, then you can just basically use our PowerShell commandlets that we offer as part of our DLM automation component. So, so as you can see, my build just got triggered and it's currently pending, so it should start any second now. While we're waiting for the build to run, let me quickly walk you through our actual build steps that we've configured here. Okay, so as I mentioned, we do offer plugins for TeamCity to define your build steps. So you can either use those plugins, or if you're more comfortable with PowerShell, you can use our PowerShell command list to define your build process. Our first step here is called DLM Automation build. And what the build means in terms of databases is making sure that all of your database objects are valid and that there is no SQL Server compilation or syntax errors. And the way we do this is by creating a copy of your database in terms of schema and any lookup data that you have on a temporary database that you specify as part of your build process. So in this case, I've dedicated a database just specifically for my build that is sitting in our dev environment. And this database basically gets rebuilt in terms of schema to make sure that all the objects are still valid. There is no broken dependencies or any SQL Server compilation errors with the files that we have, with the .SQL files that we have in source control. So that's the primary purpose of this build step here. If we can build that temporary database from scratch, then that means our database it can be compiled successfully, which is the main principle of any continuous integration process, regardless of what type of application you're looking at. You always want to make sure that you can recompile your solution, your project from scratch as part of a build process. So this is what we're doing for your database in this case. If you're using our DLM dashboard, which is our sort of schema monitoring and drift detection tool, you can actually get the tool to send a report of this build to DLM dashboard. So if you end up deploying from that build to your target environments, DLM dashboard can actually see that as an update as opposed to a drift. So you have those additional options here as part of the build process. If this build succeeds, then we go ahead and package up your database files from source control into a NuGet package, which becomes a lockdown artifact that you can take and deploy from as part of an automated release process. But on top of this, code validation or syntax validation step, and as I said, it's very important to have proper, static code analysis tests in place to run some additional tests against your database objects. Obviously, there's a lot of good, code analysis testing frameworks out there for application codes. For instance, for .NET, you have FXCOP. ReSharper has some stuff built into it. But when it comes to databases, there is nothing out of box. So that's where Redgate can help with these different testing frameworks that you can use. So for the purpose of this demo, I'm actually using both our SQL test and also our SQL code guard to run those static code analysis tests. And so here, those tests that I showed you earlier on, they're basically just stored procedures as far as SQL test is concerned. So if these are checked into source control, then our automated test process can pick those up and run them against your temporary database that you build as part of your build process. And then for SQL Code Guard, you just basically take those rules and run them against a database. So in this case, we're just running those rules against that temporary database that we built from scratch. And finally, if all the tests pass, we take the package that we built, the NuGet package, and send it to Octopus Deploy. So that way, Octopus Deploy can use that package and deploy it from there to your target environments. So let's go back and take a look at our project, see where our build is at. Oh, interesting. Let's see why our build failed. Interesting. So let's see. Take a look at our build steps real quick. Everything was working fine. So let's just double check, make sure everything's running okay. Let's just double check our working directory here real quick.
Just whilst you're doing a bit of troubleshooting there, Arneh, I think it's worth reiterating. Yep. We've got these series of different levels of testing that we're going through, and this is what's so important to actually help us to be able to have the confidence that when it comes to actually release and push this out to production, we have a good version of our database to code there. So not only have you got that initial validation step where it's checking to make sure that everything all references one another, but you're building on top of that by running that test step that potentially could have additional unit tests in there to test the functionality of your stored procedures and things like that, your functions. And then on top of that, you're going to have this SQL Code Guard step. And then finally, on top of that, you've got this kind of automated deployment step to deploy using Octopus Deploy to an integration environment. So you're kind of finishing it off by actually almost carrying out a test deployment to make sure that you can take an existing database state and change it to that new desired state. So there's
exactly
4 levels in there, right? 4 levels of checks that you're running.
Yeah, and obviously the more tests you have, the better and more reliable your automated delivery process will be.
Sure.
So, a lot of people are reluctant to have an automated delivery process because they think if they automate everything, then that that would be risky, but that would be a valid concern if you don't have the right automated tests in place to actually catch anything that breaks on your database. So it's really important to have those tests in place.
Most definitely, it's great to see, and and as we say, it's that that additional level of testing that we're having happen as part of that build process that really boosts the confidence and gives you that ability to know when you can and can't release a fresh version of your database. Release on your schedule, not somebody else's, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's see here. So I'm just running the build again once more, just to make sure that it can create our package successfully. Oh, here we go. So it looks like it ran okay this time around. Not sure what went wrong there, but anyways, we got our package as you can see here. If you go to our overview of our tests here, of our build process here, we can obviously see our tests. So as you can see, all the tests passed as part of SQL tests. I also get an artifact from our SQL code guard. So if there's any failures there, we would see those failures here in an XML file. As you can see, there is no failure, so our XML file is empty for our artifacts, specifically for SQL code guard. And finally, the NuGet package that we create. So the NuGet package, as I mentioned, is the exact same folder structure as what we put in source control, and it carries the full state of the database from our master branch that we merged to. So we're taking the state from master and saying, compare this state now from master to our target environment to see what differences exist and give us the deployment script for those changes to go out to our target environment. So now that we have our package, if I go to my packages in Octopus Deploy and refresh, you should have version 1.18 now as the latest version, which is basically the same version as our build that we just ran. So we've got our latest package. Now I can go ahead and create a release and deploy that. Really nice thing about using a release management tool is the dashboard that you get in terms of knowing what releases you've pushed out to one environment, which releases were successful, which releases failed. So you get a nice sort of central dashboard of what releases you've done, how many releases you've done, what environment is currently on what release, and being able to just push releases out to any environment with just a click of a button. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a release here and start off the deployment to my testing environment. I could automate this process end-to-end by just triggering the releases to environments based on the successful deployments to the previous environment. But for the purpose of the demo, so as you know, just so we can walk through the process, I'm just doing this manually. So go ahead and deploy to my testing environment, which is basically going to take that NuGet package, compare it against the target environment, in this case, my testing environment. And based on that, it's going to generate a set of artifacts to tell us what changes, what differences exist between our package and the environment, and what the update script is that the tool sort of is going to run against our testing environment. So we actually break down our deployment into two steps. So we create a report and an update script based on that comparison that we do. And as you can see here, here's our artifact. And then once these artifacts are generated, then we go ahead and run the update script that we generate against the target environment. So the nice thing about that is if you want to add a manual review process between the creation of the update script and the execution of it, you can use that, do that as well, depending on what release management tool you're using. So let's take a look at that report that we generate here. Okay, so here's the report from the comparison. So again, this is the comparison from the state from our package against the target environment that we're deploying to. It tells us what objects have been affected. So the salespeople table has been affected. We've added a column here. The store procedure was also modified, so we can see how it's been modified. And also the lookup data that we also modified in the address type table. for those of you who are familiar with compare and data compare, this is basically running the engine of compare and data compare in the background. So just like the UI version of compare, if there is any warnings or any changes that could result into data loss, you will see warnings on those changes here. In this case, we don't have any warnings. And finally, the deployment script that compare generates. As you can see, everything is nicely encapsulated into a single .SQL script. So here's the alter for our table to add that not null column that we added, the alter procedure, and finally the insert for the data that we added to our address type table. Everything is nicely put into a single transaction. So if for any reason the execution of your script fails, then this will roll back the transaction to the beginning. So we don't leave your target environment in an inconsistent state if for any reason the execution fails. So again, as part of your delivery process, you can have a manual intervention step to review this script before it gets executed against any of your environments, or you can just let it generate the script, generate the report, and also execute at the same time without anyone having to review changes as part of the delivery process. So that's the end-to-end process that we have put together for you guys today as part of the demo. We still have another 3 minutes, so I want to quickly hand this over to Tom, see if there is any outstanding questions that we haven't answered yet, and see if we can answer a couple of questions before we wrap up this session.
Excellent, Arneh. Thank you so much for that presentation. I thought it was an excellent demo. It's great to see the coming together of all those different components to allow that kind of level of validation and that level of testing. We've mostly answered the questions as we've been going through. There was a couple in there around, previously there was a sync build step. What's our recommendations around that now? So I think as we can see by your process, you've moved that synchronization step into the release management side of things rather than the automated build side of things, which kind of makes sense. It's a more natural fit. It's a deployment operation. We also had a mention of our diagram. Actually, our diagram includes Vault as a supported source control system, and somebody quite rightly pointed out that in SOC 5, source control 5.7, first tier support for Vault as a source control system was removed. That's true. We will update the diagram, so thank you for pointing that out. However, please don't forget that there are some generic source control system support options available when working with the Redgate SQL Toolbelt. So you can do things like work with a working folder, right? I mean, that would work, Arneh?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. I think that just about covers it. Oh, there is one. Is there an alternative for packaging other than NuGet? The components that we've looked at today, unfortunately, that is focused on NuGet packages as our preferred package format. I'd be interested to know though what your preferred alternative would be. So please, by all means, get in touch with us and let us know if you'd like to see alternative package support as part of the process. Excellent, Arneh. I think if you're all done and dusted, maybe we should just mention our maturity assessment and close us up for the day.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Excellent. Let's.
So let me make you the actually you can just make yourself the presenter.
I have the power again. Fantastic. So as we mentioned earlier, Redgate have worked with organizations from various different points on their journey towards DevOps, and through that experience, we've actually been able to produce a framework really that helps people to map the current state of their processes and the practices that they have in place to various different key indicators. And you can actually evaluate the maturity of your own processes by heading to red-gate.com/maturity. maturity assessment, and this will show you how you compare against others in similar industries in the wider space, and it will actually also give you some recommendations on what next steps you can take. So based upon where you are now, what would be a sensible next step for you to start pushing the boundaries a little for just improving the processes ever so slightly? Because even DevOps is an incremental approach, and the introduction and the adoption of DevOps is itself an incremental approach. Take a little bit, make it good, and then push it that little bit further. So I think the final thing really to say is if you do need help, by all means, please do get in touch with us. You can reach out on the contact details that were on the earlier slides for myself and Arneh, or in fact, you can contact us on databasedevops@red-gate.com. If you're interested in learning about Redgate's full and complete solution to database DevOps, then head on over to red-gate.com/solutions and take a look at the SQL toolbelt. We have also recently launched the Redgate Hub, which has a huge amount of educational content around some of these principles and the practices that Arneh's touched upon today. And you can find that at red-gate.com/hub. And finally, if you want a little bit more assistance than you can get from the materials that's available on the hub, then you can find yourself a local consultant. So head on over to red-gate.com/training/find a consultant. One last little question snuck in at the end there whilst I was talking. Will you guys have engineers at PASS Summit next week? There will definitely be a huge Redgate presence at Summit, so we look forward to seeing any of you that are attending there. Please, please, please stop by, say hello, and tell us how much you enjoyed Arneh's demonstration on the webinar today. With that, guys, I'm going to finish this up. Thanks again, Arneh, for your demonstration. It was excellent, and thanks everybody.
Oh, thanks so much for your help, Tom.
It's my pleasure.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.